an Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering Immortal Great Souls Book 1, Bastion, chapters 35 through 37, with an interlude, Imogen. In these chapters, you guys know, probably mostly, I'm going to try and figure out what the fuck is going on in Imogen's chapter, because I literally listened to it twice. I do not feel enlightened. It's giving surreal chapters for me from Cradle. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everyone. I am Natasha. Thank you very much to Dan for commissioning these episodes. Yeah, so, like I said in the intro, if you haven't read Cradle, apologies for always referencing it. I can't help you. You can help yourself by going and reading Cradle, and then you will know what I'm talking about. But there is a character named Scorio who is introduced in separate chapters from the main storyline, mostly, and you know, every time we get several chapters of Linden and then we get one of hers, and eventually you understand what's happening there. But it takes a little while before you have enough context to really follow her plot line and get it and its relevance to everything else. And that's what I'm sort of supposing is happening here with Imogen, although I'm not saying Imogen is the same type of being as Surreal is necessarily. So I am trusting that once I have context, if I were to go back and reread this, I would be like, oh, there's all kinds of stuff here, you know. But at this point, it feels like a ton of information coming at me at once, and all of it is so scattered in terms of its relevance that it's really hard for me to know what to pay attention to and what to ignore for now. And that's just the way a lot of times with things like this. And I'm trying to just let it wash over me and not get too caught up in it. But the point of this whole, process of reading with Spoil Me is that I will theorize and talk things through. So that's probably what I'm going to use a lot of my time today to do. But before that, I am going to talk about our chapters 35 and 36, which come before Imogen's. So we get pretty quickly here. I was actually really gratified by this. We get pretty quickly to see just what happens if Scorio is allowed to have his way and kind of push himself too far. And when I say this, I mean in terms of this new gauntlet, or one could say the old gauntlet. Because, he has gone through things with Naomi. And as I mentioned in the last section, it's a lot easier for her because she is so far ahead of him in her progression that she just tears through the first few rooms and gets up to 5. And apparently she gets 2 past that even. And she gets stuck up against this huge being of stone that's humongous. And she is for the next several chapters, struggling with this thing. By the time we wrap this section, she hasn't gotten past it still. And she's getting really pissed because what she is thinking is, I need to find its weak point and then I can kill it. And I'm starting to wonder if the point of that is not going to be that you need to kill the being, but just get past it and stop focusing on the being itself and observe that there's something else happening in that room. Because she's done everything she can think of and it's still able to sense her. So I'm just starting to think that maybe there's something else happening and she's just not having the looking at the big picture, I guess. There's a word that comes to mind all the time that I feel like I need to explain before I use it. But when I was in school in California, my senior year, I went to school in California at this boarding school that was for the arts. And one of my classes was earth sciences. And for that class, the school was up in the mountains. And they would take us on hikes in the woods for class a lot of the time. And there was a point where one of the teachers explained that if you are trying to hunt, it can be very easy to get zeroed in on a particular space and lose track of your peripheral vision. And he taught us a way of seeing that he called splatter vision, which I have always loved that term, and it has really stuck with me. And it's that process of looking at something and letting the rest of your vision go soft. Like as you're looking at it, you let it go slightly out of focus, and it means that you can see everything in a much clearer way. And it gives you a broader scope, and your peripheral vision is more engaged, and you are able to see patterns around you more easily because you have sort of let your mind relax. And that is sort of a thing that I feel Naomi could particularly have difficulty with, because she is somebody who is so focused in a really weird way. Scorio is focused, but he's focused on advancement to the point that he is ready to hurt himself over it because he is so desperate for it and so like angry at being held back the way he's been. She has a sort of nihilist edge to her, which she clearly has understood she needs to get away from and is trying to, but there is still a focus there on how impossible her situation is. And I feel like I could see that carrying over into these rooms where she becomes really fixated because she believes that something is standing in her way, when that's not what's standing in her way, actually. Like there's a whole other issue at hand. I feel like that might be a metaphor for her life in some ways. But anyway, so they wake up. She explains about this monster, and she says that I'm going to be able to get it next time. And if we attempt once more, it won't be as we did. You gain nothing from it. My shepherding you through your trials gains you an illusory sense of progress. Better next time that I kill one of the statues and leave you to fight your own alone. But how would I cross that room with the floating blocks? They were coming faster at me than I could follow. That was my fault, I believe. My presence triggered the room to a higher level of lethality. A cinder alone, or a group of cinders, should face a slower attack. That's good to hear. Any advice on how to tackle that room, though? It's like being attacked by 6 people at once. You can't keep track of them all. If you try to, you'll just spin in circles, leaving you even more open and vulnerable. So instead, you relax. You learn to trust your peripheral vision and your own danger senses. And that was giving splatter vision for me very much. And when she says, do you think I saw every block that flew at us? He says, I actually did. I guess not. And she says, no. The higher you progress, the more you'll rely on instinct, reflex, and muscle memory. And I really like that in terms of the idea that it's not just like suddenly you become omniscient. It's a different sort of sense that you begin to develop that we all have, but we don't hone most of the time because we don't really need to. So he says, want to go again? And she says, you do know you're paying a price for this. Sure, said Scorio, waving a hand as if pushing her concerns aside, then blinked as she fell out of focus. The pain takes a toll on the body. Not just the body, but beyond that, it's not safe to just lie here for hours unguarded. We're still in the ruins, Scorio. All it would take was one predator stumbling upon us when we reappeared, all racked in agony and unable to defend ourselves, for this experiment to end. And she turns out to be right much sooner than I would have guessed. So yeah, he says, let's give it another go now. And she says no. And he gets so disproportionately angry, and he understands pretty quickly that his rage here is just not reasonable. That the way that he is reacting is like a little unnatural. But he is also having a lot of other reactions. Going out of focus, vertigo, his heart is pounding, his skin is sort of prickling, and he feels as if he's almost developing a fever, and he's like just sweating profusely. And what I kept thinking about here was almost like the sensation when your blood sugar drops way too low. And you there's no fighting that kind of feeling. And there's something about these sorts of moments when you experience them as a person who often we can trick ourselves into thinking that we're very in control of our circumstances. When we realize that, like, our body can only do so much before we are out of the control booth and our body takes the reins away from us. And when I went to the Beyonce concert with Rashawn, I didn't realize how little I had eaten all day. And then we went to the concert and it was a long walk to, like, get inside. I didn't eat anything, but I did get like a can of alcoholized seltzer and I drank that. It was like a 3-hour long show and we danced and everything and we're walking out of there. And as we get outside, I started to sweat and get dizzy. And I came so close to passing out and I had to lay down. I couldn't even sit up. I was so fucked up that I had to lay flat on my back because my body would not support me. And there was some angel there selling drinks out of a cooler. Must have made so much money that night. And I got a Gatorade and it, like, saved my life. But I was so humbled in that moment at realizing, like, you can't just do what you want. Your body needs things. And Scorio really seems to think that he can just tell his body, no, we're still going, and will it to do what it wants. That's not how it works, bro. And I said this in the beginning of the coverage of this book that, like, there was a lot of emphasis on just pushing and pushing and pushing, and that if you just want to bad enough that you can always do it. And I emphasized at that time, that isn't real. And it seems that this author also wants to underscore it. It just takes a little longer for Scorio to get to this point and for us to see just how far he's willing to go. But the author is just as aware as I was. He just waited a bit to make his point here. And Scorio is like, it's borderline death wish. That's really what it comes down to a little bit later on, but we'll get to that conversation. So, she has to walk with him home because she's like, you're never getting through the ruins back to where you sleep safely without my help. And otherwise I'd have to carry you if we did another one of these, and I can't fucking fight anything off. So no, we're going back now. And he finally gives in. And as they walk back, he is getting worse and worse. He can't breathe. He's wheezing. She's talking to him. He doesn't even understand what she's saying. He fucking falls on his face and passes out. And when he wakes up, he's in a bed. And it's actually like a pretty comfy situation. And there is, like, decor. Carpets were scattered haphazardly across the stone floor. Heavy pieces of battered furniture were set against the walls, ranging from dressers to wardrobes, half of them looking to have been scavenged from under landslides and cave-ins. A large table was covered in arcane alchemical equipment, while thick candles of differing heights were clustered across most of their surfaces, with melted wax having hardened into waterfalls over the edges and pooled on the floor. White curtains, gauzy and insubstantial, drifted into the room from where they fringed a large doorway that led out onto a half-ruined balcony. The light outside betrayed either first or second bronze, and propping himself up on his elbows, Scorio gazed around blankly, having no idea how he'd come here. Everywhere he looked, more details suggested themselves. There, a basket filled with vibrant rolls of yarn, the balls ranging from sulphurous yellow to the rich incarnadine. A small dead tree was planted in a clay pot in one corner, its branches of the smoothest alabaster, and from which hung countless shells of iridium green and deep cobalt blue, their reflected surfaces causing spangles of light to slowly swing across the walls and ceiling. I just loved getting to see her, where she lives and how she has tried to make it beautiful. And it really betrays that there is something in her that wants more. And she has been, in her very cautious way, attempting to create that for herself. But she definitely, it seems, needed some kind of prodding. And it's just really touching, because I think a lot of us, if we were to predict what her living space was going to look like, would probably have guessed it would be a lot less decorative and a lot more severe and practical and just, essentials. And when I realized how much she had done to try and soften it and make it personal, I was genuinely taken off guard by that. And I really loved it. It was just like understandable how protective she is of this space as well, because later on he shows up and she's feeling a bit of a way that he came back without being invited, and she eventually sort of overlooks it, but it's not like she is forgotten entirely. She overlooks it for the moment, and then it feels like the conversation goes a bit left, and so she closes up again. But this is clearly her space in a way that her protectiveness of it makes a lot of sense. And it feels like it's more than just her being protective of her territory. It feels like she has made a space that's safe for her that took her a long time. Like she had difficulty coming to a place where she was even willing to make this space her own like this. So she's all the more afraid of somebody stomping all over that, I'm sorry, guys. I don't know if you can hear that, but there is a weird sound, and I'm not sure if the mic is picking it up, and I can't tell what it is. Anyway, so the conversation that they have here is, it's very obvious that she's feeling awkward and nervous about bringing him here, about showing him this side of herself at all. She fumbles something and breaks it, and he asks her why did you choose to live here? Because she says she's been here about a year, and she says none of your business. And when he immediately backs off and is like, you're right, it's not my business, I'm sorry, it seems like the fact he's willing to admit it's not his business softens her enough that she tells him. And I'm so sorry, you guys. That sound, it sounds for all the world to me like hail, but there's nothing happening outside. I can see out my window. I'm so sorry to be distracted, but it's really loud. But the story that she tells him is when she has gotten to this really bad place, and that she climbed up here and felt that the building was shifting under her, and was okay with it. Basically, what she's saying is, I was in a place where I was willing to die, and when it looked like I might, I got excited about it, and was like, finally. There was a sense of I've been waiting to see what would kill me, because I knew I didn't care enough to protect myself, and I was going through the motions and leaving it up to fate. And when the building began to shift, it was fate saying, okay, you're done now. And I was glad to have that decision taken out of my hands in a way. Obviously, the tower didn't fall, but it felt like the wager was still on. I started coming back here every night, and thoughts of jumping off towers ended. I decided instead that I'd better take care of myself and let this tower decide if I was to fall or not. Leave the question in the hands of the ruins. And slowly I started bringing things here and making the space my own. And I really appreciate how much this experience has led her to recognize some of what's going on with Scorio. So the way that he's talking about how he pushed himself too hard, it seems pretty clear that despite the fact that he experienced what he did, a part of him still doesn't seem to really believe that he pushed himself too hard, if that makes sense. It's almost like he's still acting as if he could have controlled himself better if he had known it was coming, and not as if he had just gone beyond the limits of his own body. And she says to him, about keeping you at the edge, how I told you good trainers know how to do that without pushing you too hard so that they lose all hope or ambition. And he says, yeah, that hasn't happened to me. I'm more excited now than I have ever been. And she says, yeah, that's the problem. What's the downside of working with coal mana? And he says it's crude, low quality. You said a great soul can gain strength at the expense of control. Precisely. If you push yourself like you did yesterday, you'll gain strength. There's no question. You'll find that your heart can absorb more mana, and perhaps it's even the fastest way to reach Emberling, but it will come at a cost. Loss of control. You'll be sloppy. You'll burn through mana faster than you realize, will flare out and die off. Worse, your heart will take damage and your mind will suffer. Training in that manner will cause you to become raw. Mentally exhausted, you'll make bad decisions, you'll make mistakes, your temper will get the better of you, making you easier to manipulate, goad into falling for traps. Power is not the sole element of the equation. There also needs to be control. And he says, but my training is all I can control right now. And I'll pay the cost. And she's like, dude, you're not listening. You will be a shadow of what you could have been. I've seen people do it and they all had to be put down. So you're saying I should train slower. Let the others get even more ahead of me. Content myself with crawling when I could run. No. And now a touch of fire entered her tone, and he remembered in a flash that within her was the Nightmare Lady, that being of impossible strength and finesse. You train smarter. Are you not listening to me? You want to gain strength as quickly as you can. I get it. So does everybody. And eventually she says, I am telling you, these constant deaths will shock your heart, and you need to absorb those shocks and integrate them. And resting is integral. That's what does it. Training is the active part. Sleeping is the passive part when your heart grows powerful. If you don't rest, you'll collapse. And this is exactly true about any kind of training. You can't just do it relentlessly. You have got to take breaks, and it's really, really difficult because I think a lot of us just have some impatience with the passive process of things, and we have a hard time really believing that it does anything for us. It always, we are a people. And when I say we, I really mean Americans specifically, but I know that people in general are like this. It's just Americans have a particular relationship with this sort of thing. But media has shown us the repeated montages of people becoming stronger and getting better at whatever, whether it's a movie about sports or about chess or about art or music, whatever. You see the montage of somebody putting themselves to the task and just going. And so we imagine that we can somehow fast forward it for ourselves. And if we just train without break, we will be able to create that montage, which of course will lead us to the same place that character wound up, which is genius and success. And it's just not linear like that, and it's not as fast as that. It always takes longer than you think it's going to take. And for myself, I've talked about this already because I've started running again, but I have realized that I was trying to push myself to run for longer periods in my intervals than I really could handle. And it set me back. And now I have dropped back my interval, and it's only 45 seconds again of running and 2 minutes of walking, which is galling to me that I'm still at this point after 3 months. But you know what? My times are still getting better. My heart rate is dropping during my runs now so that it's not as high, which means my cardiovascular health is improving. And I think at my current weight, if I were to push myself to run for longer, I could actually injure myself because I'm carrying a lot of weight on my joints and on my shins. And you just have to take all of this stuff into account as much as we just don't want to. I get it. I get it so much. I am an instant gratification sort of girl. I really do understand. And Scorio is so resentful of his friends' advantages, not of them, but the fact that he has been kept from accessing what they can. He is, in a way, I think, trying to just stick it to the man by pushing himself and being like, see, I can do it too. And you're not proving anything to anybody, dude. You're just fucking yourself. You've got to get your head straight. And he does. He winds up eventually really listening to her, as we can see later. But yeah. And she asks him at one point, have you done any of the other training I taught you. And he straight up doesn't even remember what she means for a second. And when he realizes, he gets really embarrassed because it's the learning to sustain the saturation of his heart while, like not letting go of it. And it's very tedious and boring. And she recognizes how difficult that aspect of it is for him and is like, yeah, that's what you're gonna fucking do. You will resume training as mandated. You will focus as much on manipulating your mana and saturating your heart as you will dying. You will hone your focus. You will do the hard, boring work and not focus on the easy task of dying or hunting fiends. And when he challenges her about calling it easier, she says, yes, dying is easy. Nihilism is easy. Throwing yourself off the top of a tower can be far, far easier than resisting the urge and forcing yourself to wait for another dawn. And she ain't wrong about that. At all. Also, just the hard, boring work. That's exactly it. We want our highlight reel to be our real life. And unfortunately, the hard, boring work is what's always skipped in a montage because it's boring. That's exactly it. But that's the part that actually matters. It's no accident that in skipping something, like, we make it look more attractive and easier. And it turns out, for some reason, it never seems to work that way. It's because it's actually built on the part we're not showing, which is the discipline of doing it over and over again. So, 36, Scorio trained. And he is learning to saturate his heart. He is learning to really hear it when she's giving him advice in a way that hasn't seemed to be penetrating before. And we find out about igniting his heart and how the more deep and the more mana it can hold, the more difficult it gets to ignite because it's larger. And she compares it to trying to light a log on fire with a match versus a twig. Of course, a twig will go up more easily and it burns out and flares and it's gone. And a log takes longer to catch, but it has a more sustained fuel to it and goes for a lot longer and emits a lot more heat. So he's training. She notices that he's catching on so quickly that he had to have had martial training before he reached this age in his first life. And then we have a really interesting thing where the exercises that she showed him where she's fighting off foes that aren't there. He does it and she's like, you're just fucking flinging your hand out at air. And he's like, well, yeah. And she's like, no, the point of this is that you imagine there is somebody really there trying to fucking kill you. And if you can get that in your head, this will be as effective for you almost as the gauntlet itself, because you will be in a state of protecting your life that will mirror the state that you're in the gauntlet without actually having to put yourself through that. And he sort of wonders if maybe this was developed to make it so that people could train without the gauntlet. And she sort of is like, I'm not saying that, but maybe, I don't know. So he starts to take that a lot more seriously and gets a lot better at that. So eventually, let's see, his runs become his favorite part of the evening, and he goes and checks on his flowers and whatnot. His thoughts would still, his will would relax, and he'd simply inhabit his body, moving easily, his pace carrying him all the way around the perimeters to his starting spot, the ruins made ethereal and beautiful by the rain. He'd run 4 laps, and when he ended up at his chamber, he'd sit on the windowsill cross-legged and devour his evening meal. He'd watch the rest of the rain peter out as he spooned the gruel into his mouth, feeding the furnace that was his appetite, watching the ruins come alive at night until at last, satiated and exhausted, he'd step over to his blanket stretched out over the stone floor and lay down. So, the gauntlet again. This is one of the moments that I really liked when she tells him, center yourself. You need to master yourself if you want to master your foe. And the way this is written is great. Before, Such words might have irritated Scorio, sounded flippant or shallow. But after working hard at his first form, after spending so many hours meditating and manipulating Cole, they were instead a truth he wrestled with, a path he'd failed to walk. And I really love that because it is the sort of line that you could see it being like, sounding so trite as to almost be comical, like you're in a bit, become the, whatever fucking Karate Kid-esque type of shit. And yet, things like this become mantras or rules to live by because they're very true. And that's what's so difficult about cliches like this, is the fact that they became the cliche because they're true, but due to the fact that they are said so often, you don't even really hear the words anymore. It can just feel dismissive almost, and make you feel like somebody isn't really giving adequate weight to what your experience currently is, or is telling you something that ultimately isn't really relevant. So I like the fact that because he has really listened to her in other areas, her saying this is landing for him, because I think that's a good sign for his training. The fact that he has begun to understand that maybe somebody who's as far ahead of him in training as she isn't just blowing smoke and knows what she's talking about. Like, I want him to trust that a little bit more. He really does think he knows better a lot. And maybe at times he's willing to risk a little bit more and prove that she is willing to give up maybe a bit too easily. But she has more knowledge than he does. That's just a fact. So anyway, he finally manages to defeat all of the statues without dying. And he is really, really excited about it. But when he goes into the next room, oh man, he's trying to use his ability to sense what's coming to avoid these blocks. And they just absolutely crush him. At first, he manages to move aside in time, but it pretty quickly just disappears on him. And he gets crushed. And when he wakes up, he is in real pain. He has been basically turned into a paste, So yeah. And this is when, of course, he wakes up to see this giant insect right next to the beer. He is not able to really do anything but push himself off the beer and fall down. And Naomi manages to kill the thing. And I love when she says, I don't say these things. My warnings aren't for my own amusement. Perhaps even I should start listening to them. And let's see, I'm trying to make sure that oh yeah, that's right. He invites her to hang out with him and his friends on 8th day. And she says that she may, but she's not really sure if she wants to go. She has a lot of, I understand. Meeting new people is always difficult for me anyway. But when you've been alone as long as she has, and the amount of time it's taken to build up trust for him at all, adding 2 new people into the equation, especially people who are students at a place that did you dirty a lot, that's going to be tricky. I get it. So, okay, finally, we are now at Imogen's chapter. And this whole thing, so Imogen has this black gown, and she has black hair, and she has a host of the dead following her. I am assuming this is literal. I'm not thinking that this is meant to be metaphoric. Their tread, the sound of their bony feet as they prowled behind her, lingering at every corner, wasn't real, but still she heard it, knew that they were there. All reduced, their spirits sucked away by Numenon as a cannibal might slurp marrow from a cracked bone. On she walked, wondering if she had grown tired of being alone, lost in abstracted thought and pondering the turns and bifurcations of the maze. And there is a point at which it's mentioned that she's looking blindly around her. And I couldn't tell if that was literal, that she actually can't see, or if it is that she is simply in the dark and that's, just looking around doesn't do her any good. I think it's the latter. So she's having these different memories of like a cave that she's coming toward on a boat. She makes herself forget it for whatever reason. She rose into the air, buoyed aloft by an upswelling of shadow, rising above the walls of the labyrinth so that it stretched out around her, covering the inside of the great sphere in which she existed, the grooves and contortions of the many paths reminding her of the bizarre folding patterns she'd observed on freshly removed brains. Which, why'd you observe that? What you doing, Imogen? Don't love that. She stared across the sphere's center at the distant palace that emerged from the labyrinth's heart. Adumbrated, I don't know how to say that. I've never seen that word before. This author uses frequently words that I don't know, which is enjoyable. If only I could make myself actually remember them, I'd feel like I was really learning something. But the only word I have learned is abstruse, which wasn't even a word the author used. It was a word that came up as a synonym for a word the author used, which I have forgotten. So my memory is no good. But adumbrate, it says Adembrate. Okay. According to this, I think dictionary is giving me the right thing. Means to report or represent in outline, indicate faintly, foreshadow or symbolize. Okay. Cool. So she thought she heard music. A cold, severe wind blew, tugging at her gown. Were they dancing? Did she hear slippered feet on parquet floors? With a blink, she dragged her gaze down the labyrinth, and the new path arrested its approach, stilled and shivered like a hound beneath the eye of a cruel master. No, she'd not cheat. The straight line collapsed, complicated itself with interceptions and intersections. Dead vines writhed up from the dirt to cover these new partitions, and with a sigh, Imogen allowed herself to sink back down to the ground between the high, stark walls, her gown alighting softly about her, her hair stilling. They would be dancing. He would be there, smiling genially, handsome and virile, master of all that his dark gaze fell upon. And she keeps mentioning this he, and at one point talks about how he'd be tapping his foot to the music right now. And I can't tell if this is real or if it's like a sort of like if this is all sort of a game that it's meant to motivate her to get to the end, and this like little treat is sort of set up for her that isn't real. I don't know. But she feels, all of a sudden, this energy that is very old, and like almost instantly, she thinks Bastion? She extended her hand before her, fingers splayed and focused more fiercely. Yes, an ancient power had stirred. She snatched her hand back to her lips. The portal. It couldn't be. Never had. So why now? But again, she felt that flicker. She turned to one side, turned back, seeking him to confirm, but he wasn't there, of course. She took turns at random, tried to push away the sensation, to bury it, failed. What if it were true? What if the portal were opening at long last? A terror, she could go look. She could go see for herself. And perhaps, if it were so, then they could go through together, could put the past behind them, the deaths and misunderstandings, the mistakes and mass murders. Mistakes and mass murders. Putting those two together feels like it shouldn't be allowed, but I guess. So, she extends her will, and the walls of this labyrinth just disappear, and she is able to push through this ward that she created, apparently. So all of this is a test that she has set for herself, or has helped to build, at least. The fabric of her moon tore, and the labyrinth folded away and behind her, collapsing in on itself as she flew through the ethereal gap and into a great chasm in the earth. Another obstacle, this one more formidable than the last, created during a moment of regrettable madness and self-loathing. Johannes stood at the chasm's far end, enlarged into a perfect giant, his crimson curls wreathed about his perfect brow, his eyes dull and lusterless, his cheeks ashen, his bare chest carved with muscle, and that one livid hole above his heart. I'm assuming that this is somebody that she killed and regrets killing. But maybe it's the person that she's talking about waiting for her inside the castle? Or perhaps they are the same person? I don't know. And eventually she gets to this place, and the way that this is described, I do not like at all. The final ward, unlike the others, created by herself against herself, summoned and put in place to keep her at bay, and thus ultimately futile. Imogen lowered her face, covered it with both hands, and with a cry flew forward, racing along that narrow beach, unseeing, her heart lacerating, until untold miles later she came to a stop. Well, what on earth is that? There's voice... I'm assuming that this is the memory of a mass murder that she regrets. I don't know. But it says she was free, she was out, she was back in hell. The sky was rich with cerulean blue, dove gray, and lavender striations, which again just sounds very much like our own sky. So where is hell? An emerald fern giant stood close at hand, towering some 30 yards into the sky, streams of translucent diamond mana rising from the Mycotal Mesa into its outstretched verdant hand. What does Mycotal mean? I looked it up. Dictionary says no definition found. I don't know what to think. It turned its huge antlered head to stare down at her, the symbol of power glowing beneath its ivy face with a luminous golden green hue, its broad mouth flattening into a line. So, I don't know. I'm trying to even imagine what this means. An emerald fern giant? Is this humanoid? I'm assuming. Lifting her palm, she sent forth a dozen vortices, which flew up and away to some several thousand yards, forming a perfect circle around her, and immediately began to drain all the diamond mana in the region into her lacuna, which I know that lacuna can mean... Yeah, okay, an unfilled space or interval, a gap. Power flowed into her like a cataract, and with a smile, she fashioned her shroud, pulled her ferula from her spirit, and ignited her aura. Ferula. A tall, large-leaved Eurasian plant of a genus that includes Asafoetida and its relatives, a rare term for ferule. A genus of about 20 species of flowering plants. I don't know if that's actually relevant here, if it's a plant or not. A mile away, the fern giant groaned and toppled, its luxurious body turning ashen and then collapsing in on itself as emerald mana streamed toward the closest vortex and into her lacuna. So, this whole area, she is just killing, basically, in order to absorb the mana that she wants. And again, it's being called hell, but it seems really pretty for hell. I was thinking hell would be a lot less pleasant than this sounds like it is. Her mind clearing and focusing on that distant fleck of ancient power, Bastion was almost on the far side of hell. Even if she used the interstitial rivenings to pass through the center, it would take her days to reach it. the closest entrance only a few hundred miles north. Her vortices collapsed upon themselves, her shroud flared, and streamlining her aura, she blasted forward, a column of shadow bearing her faster than thought, her departure tearing massive rents in the mesa as a dull boom shattered the sky. And she's heading to Bastion, and I don't think that seems great. I don't know. Maybe it's fine. But she seems like somebody you don't want around. She's just a bit of a disaster. She doesn't even seem evil, even though talking about mass murders like it's just a mistake feels a little evil. But she seems just like bad news. You know? Like, what she reminds me of, in a vague sense, is sort of like a drug addict. Where a drug addict's addiction isn't their fault. Addiction is a real thing that changes who you are. But that doesn't alter the fact that they create misery around them because of that addiction. So you can simultaneously not blame somebody for their addiction and also not want them in your life. And not want them around to fuck your whole shit up, because they will. And you can acknowledge that without making it be like you don't like them as a person. And she feels like a weirdly combo of like bad decisions and deep regret for some of those decisions, but also not having really learned her lesson a little bit. That's just what I'm getting on the surface here. So I may be wrong, but we'll see, Imogen. We will see. All right. So now we go to 37. He goes to check on the reeds that he has inserted in his plants. And he is able to find these little tiny seeds and tries to tip the first one into the bottle, and it won't. And then eventually he manages to use his will to pull the bead out. A second black oval appeared at the base of the bottle as if by magic, then slowly melded with the first. And he goes through all of them and collects enough for 6 elixirs, which is pretty fucking good. And then he decides to go and see Naomi at her place. And it's like he's almost there when he starts to think to himself, maybe I shouldn't have done this. She might not like it, but I'm kind of like right here. And I have like something really special. This is special circumstances. Maybe she's fine. Maybe she's fine with it. Yeah, let's just do it. And like before he can stop himself, he knocks on the door. And she is really not friendly. Literally, one of the first things she says is, I knew I shouldn't have brought you here. But he, very, very intelligently, in my opinion, pulls the vial out and shows her that to distract her from that thought. And it does work. And he explains about it being the condensed cold mana. 159 plants. I'd leave you alone if I had an alchemical laboratory in my own rooms, I swear. But seeing as how I'm but a poor, indigent orphan, cast upon the mercies of this cruel world. Okay, enough. But if you want me to work on this, you'd best take a vow of silence. And he comes in and is dead quiet. And eventually she's like, okay, you being quiet is also very bad. So fine, talk. But just like, not a lot. What's the term for half poisonous elixir? Idiocy. That's it. I'd like to only filter out half the toxins. According to the treatise I purchased, that should ensure the elixir is as strong as the tincture I drank, while I only suffer half the side effects. Idiocy. You do understand there's a reason great souls everywhere don't abuse their bodies and hearts like you do. I know, but we've discussed this before. True. Very well. We'll filter half the toxins out. That should only cost you a morning. You plan to give up your every morning from here on out? No, I'm hoping to build up a tolerance. Second, I plan to walk it off. Third, I'm working on the third part. I plan to walk it off. I'm sure you do, bud. You just plan that pretty much as a default. He's learned some things, but he hasn't learned all the things. So he goes and sits, and she works in silence, and things seem somewhat companionable. And he brings up the heartstones and thinking about going to sell them. I think the tincture you're making will be weak level bronze in terms of potency. Your classmates at the academy will receive a filtered pill each morning, if not better, but their baseline should be minimal copper. Each spoonful you take of this mixture will be 20 times stronger than what they usually receive. Good to hear. There's another reason I haven't taken the sapphire vials, nor given one to you. Do you know how many times more powerful one of those vials is than your bronze level spoonfuls? I know. How many? The whole vial, if it's base sapphire, is 50 times more potent than the poison you'll be taking. Do you know what would happen if you drank it? No. Your heart is that of a cinder, and though it's strong and unusually deep, I reckon it can't comfortably hold half of one of your pills. The rest, when you eat it, will simply stretch your heart and then dissipate. If you were to drink that vial, your heart might sunder, and the vast majority of the sapphire mana would be wasted. The same, unfortunately, goes for me. I've got to increase the amount of mana I can hold in my heart till I can barely ignite. What do you have to do? I have to condense my heart back to its former size, and in doing so, return to my former ignition point. Over the past few years, I've made some advances in that direction. My heart is no longer this vast and unwieldy object I can barely control, but it's still far from where I was before I made Emberling. Oh, so you retain capacity and decrease mass. Something like that. You have what's called a reservoir within your heart. That's what holds the mana and dictates the amount you can hold. You're seeking to expand your reservoir as much as you can to increase the amount of mana you can drink at the cost of being able to ignite quickly. I'm trying to squeeze it back into a regular-sized igneous heart while retaining the amount I can absorb and regain my original reactivity. Once it reaches maximum density, your trial triggers. I see. So you don't even really need the high-quality mana at this stage. You just need to work on your control over your heart. True. I may not even be able to use it till I make Tombspark, but then it will prove vital if I'm to reach Flame Vault. And that is none of your business. How did we get on that topic? I was trying to tell you something about your elixirs. There's no sense in keeping the toxin level high if you're still going to vent most of the mana each time you consume it. I disagree. My heart has to grow used to the strain. The more I strain it, the faster and larger it will grow, at the expense of its integrity, your health, and your sanity. He shrugged. I'll make sure I don't go too far. Why don't I believe you? Yeah, honestly, Scorio, I just feel like you should have learned right now, you don't know where too far is. You're not good at telling. So saying that you'll be sure not to take it too far, how do you think you're going to manage that when you don't know anything? In the end, she's just like, whatever, it's your heart and body. And she's right. She has to let him, to a point, do what he's going to do. She can't control everything. She has told him what she can, and he has to make the choices ultimately. So, fair. But it's just so frustrating that Scorio has learned so much in some ways and is growing to trust her word and the way that she instructs him on prioritizing certain aspects of his training. And then there are things like this where it feels like he is just not willing to compromise at all. So he says, bring the syrup to my place tomorrow at first rust. That's when Leonis and Leonci will be arriving. You can simply meet them. And if you don't like what you see, we'll say you came by to drop off the mana, but if you feel more comfortable, you can come with us to the academy. I don't need my hand held, she snapped. Of course you don't. Just an idea. And sensing that her mood was turning sour, he rose smoothly to his feet. I really appreciate that Scorio is able to be on the alert for when she's just not gonna fucking hear him. She is definitely somebody who She has baggage and it makes her somewhat moody. And that's not women be crazy talk. That's just her experience. Scorio is also moody, but it's a really different set of circumstances for him that causes him to go that way. His moodiness is, his sort of nihilist streak in his temper. And hers is also a nihilist streak, but in a stranger direction. And also making herself vulnerable at all is really just difficult for her. So as he's leaving, he says, humming to himself, he skipped lightly down the stairs. Everything was falling into place. The syrup would give him the raw power he needed. The gauntlet was proving to be the perfect source of tension and training. And his friendship with Leonis, Leonci, and Naomi meant that he no longer felt alone in the world. Everything was starting to look up. Better yet, tomorrow was the 8th day, which meant meeting up with Leonci and Leonis, and Scorio couldn't wait to show them how far he'd advanced. Oh no. I don't like this at all. You can't go around thinking how great everything seems now. How you are so excited about stuff. Look, I am an optimist, and I don't mean this in my personal fashion, although there are times where I look around and I think everything's been going a little too well. What the fuck? What's going to happen? I won't deny that I get there sometimes in my brain. But in a book, absolutely not. You can't have your main character be like, sweet, it's all coming up Milhouse. Like, no, everything's about to go wrong. It's about to be bad. I really don't like this for him. Something is going to interrupt things somehow, and it's all going to not go to plan. And I'm going to assume that this is like Dola's people or something, that they're going to finally make a move somehow. And I don't even know whether it's going to be Dola specifically or the person that was meant to take the order from Dola that had which I feel like that's particularly bad. If Dola is able to sort of snitch on him to the person who has the kind of power that can process Sapphire, Scorio is going to be in for a bad time. So I just didn't like the way this ended, because it's just, However, I can't deny, I'm also feeling great about this in a way as well. She has opened up enough to him that she has shared where she lives with him. And that was something that was really bothering him recently. The fact that she has just not let him in at all. And so he feels like she doesn't see him seriously as any sort of ally. And that's clearly beginning to change. And so that's great. I love the fact that this gauntlet thing, even though he is still doing it, that she has shown him an exercise in which he can continue to advance without going and actually dying. The little flower garden working out really, really well. Amazing. Awesome. I am at this point extremely curious about how much he can sell those little heartstones for. That's what I'm really, really wondering now. It's like, how valuable are they? And I'm sure it varies according to what the creature and maybe how old it is or something. But if he can actually make some real money there. He comments at one point, because she has made a sort of cistern where she collects rainwater and it pours directly down into her funnel in her room. And he's thinking to himself like, oh my God, I could have saved myself so many trips. That's genius. And I would like for him to begin to use his money to make his living space a little bit more bearable. He says something about how it'd be nice to not sleep on a blanket. It is getting old. So that's something that I'm kind of interested in, is seeing him beginning to settle in a realer way. Because so far, every resource that he has had has gone straight into his training. And there is something bleak about that. I don't necessarily think he's going to be a little whimsical and have a tree with shards of shell tied to it like she's got. I am thinking it's going to be much more basic even than that, but it will be a start. So, yeah. Sorry, I didn't even see Dan's in the chat saying Murphy is always listening about Murphy's Law, and that's true, man. It just really feels that way sometimes. I don't like it. I don't want to live like that mostly, but I understand when people have why did you say that out loud kind of reaction, Anyway, all right, I got to wrap this up, but thank you again very much, Dan, for commissioning this episode, enjoying this book a lot. And until next time, toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.